over 26 members of the Putin family in senior roles of the Russian government. Many of those people are things like the Deputy Minister of Defense, who is his niece, or her husband is the Minister of Energy. So together, that family is bringing in a lot of money illicitly from the Russian government. And that's something they want to keep going. Now, going ahead, it's going to be interesting how Putin tries to analyze what's the best step. Remember, for him, he's not working in democracy. He's not worried about what's good for Russia. He's interested in what's good for Vladimir Putin.
How much time does Putin have till his economy collapses? Why did he need energy truce? Will Ukraine exchange Donbas on US security guarantees? And what should we wait from the next round of Abu Dhabi peace talks? All of this I'm about to discuss with political analyst and advisor Jason J. Smart. Jason, thanks for being here.
It's great to see you as always.
Do you agree that Vladimir Putin is running out of time to reach a peace deal in the war against Ukraine as Russia struggles with a growing budget deficit to finance the invasion?
Yes, it's becoming increasingly more difficult for Putin to continue this war. And it's not something that he could do indefinitely. Russia historically, in negotiations, always tries to act like time is on its side. It always tries to draw things out and it goes slowly. And for countries like Russia's, that is to say autocracies, that's a strategy they can do because they're less beholden to things like public opinion or the news cycle. But ultimately, you have to finance wars. And Putin's economy does not allow him to continue going as he's been going for the past 4 years. So going ahead, it's going to become increasingly difficult for him to keep kicking the can down the road. And what's the good sign is that within Russia, we see that things are getting worse. We know that he cannot continue this forever. So Putin might pretend like everything's okay, but all the evidence is quite the contrary.
Yeah, but actually, despite everything you said, Putin shows no signs of being willing to abandon his maximalist territorial demands in eastern Ukraine.
Absolutely the case. We have to understand that Vladimir Putin himself wished to divide from the Russian state. So what Putin understands or does not understand is a little bit different, I think, than what its own government might understand. Russia's military officers have been replaced at very high numbers. We've seen increasingly that there is problems within the Russian military and in the Russian Navy. They've replaced also admirals. And that's all because things are not going well for Russia. Now, does Vladimir Putin realize why that is? It's not about the generals not doing a good job. It's because Russia is fundamentally unprepared for this sort of war. However, his own desire to keep going, to keep fighting this war, is something that is profitable to him and his family. There's over 26 members of the Putin family in senior roles of the Russian government. Many of those people are things like the Deputy Minister of Defense, who is his niece, or her husband is the Minister of Energy. So together, that family is bringing in a lot of money illicitly from the Russian government. And that's something they want to keep going. Now, going ahead, it's going to be interesting how Putin tries to analyze what's the best step. Remember, for him, he's not working in democracy. He's not worried about what's good for Russia. He's interested in what's good for Vladimir Putin. And in his eyes, making money is good. Staying in power is good. Ultimately, it's not about Ukraine. This war has never been about Ukraine. It is about him trying to balance within Moscow what is necessary within the oligarchical class to maintain power.
I would like to ask you which tools Putin will use to postpone collapse of Russian economy.
Russia's already going through a lot of the motions now. We've seen that their banks, the central bank, has already put limits on how much money people could take out daily. It's quite a low sum. We see the limits they're putting on as to transfers out of banks as well. But why are they doing this right now? And why such small things, like we're talking several $100s? It's because there's such significant economic problems within Russia. In fact, it's the structural problems within the banking and finance system. Look at the number of banks that are taking out repo loans. That is, the central bank loans the money in the short term so they have liquidity to cover the week's transactions. But what's more interesting is if we look at major banks in Russia, like the credit bank, about 28% of loans there are toxic. Now, what's interesting about that, when you have about 28% of people who are delinquent over 90 days on their paying back of loans, plus you have an increasing number. Every month it's more. In fact, Russia just broke a new record with the number of bankruptcies it had. But either way, as we see this increasing, why that's important is because for Russia itself, we see that they do not have the structural base to continue financing this war. The Russian government has taken out incredible sums of money from the banks in order to pay for the war. But those banks are not getting repaid. But that means that money is ultimately not existent. That is, the government cannot pay back that money. And that money is the people's money. It's the depositors' money. But that is being spent on a war And how will the Russian government ever get that money back? Consider this. When you take out loans to do something like build tanks, how are you going to pay that back? The tank doesn't derive a profit. You're not going to be able to use that for any other future endeavors. And you can't even melt down the metal when it's used up because it's going to be destroyed somewhere in Ukraine. That money just disappears. And when it gets disappeared, well, what that means in real terms is that that loan will never get paid back by the Russian government. They're taking out all the money for their banks to make this work. Already, they're spending 7% of GDP. But in reality, if you look at how much they're taking out of the banks as well, it's far more than that. But consider also this. The structural problems that the banks are borrowing from each other to make this possible is serious. Even so much so that there are think tanks close to the Kremlin, who already says 4 or 5 months ago, that there will be cascading defaults in the Russian banking sector before the next 12 months, unless they are able to get this on track. But at this point, they're doing nothing to do so. So it looks like it is very probable that we'll see very, very high inflation in the near term in Russia. Remember, the ruble, and a lot of people say, but why is the ruble doing okay today? Remember, the ruble is not a normal currency. It's not like the dollar where it is bought and sold every day, and so it fluctuates a lot. The ruble is essentially set by the central bank because there's not a market for rubles. As a result, when it goes ahead, and we will see probably in the coming weeks, they will have to devalue the ruble to make ends meet. And as that happens, it's going to become more and more complicated for Putin to keep the show on the road.
When it comes to Russian shadow fleet, in your opinion, how could events develop in terms of it?
The shadow fleet itself, I think, is a fascinating situation. So we've seen that the amount that they have to pay now for insurance has increased dramatically, so much so that the average person who is using one of their ships to engage in the shadow fleet is now paying somewhere between 26 to 76% of the total profit they would have made is not going to insurance. So already it's just not economically a great deal. Moreover, if you consider the fact that if your ship gets taken, that's going to be expensive because not only do you lose the ship, but you're going to have court cases for years in the future. You're also going to have criminal liability. All this cuts into the profit for them. Now, Russia is struggling still today to make this work, and it doesn't appear that it is going to work out for the shadow fleet. Increasingly, it seems it's going to be impossible given the high cost of operating it. In total, there's only a few hundred boats or ships that are engaged in the shadow fleet. But Russia, barring that, will have to only be able to sell oil over land, and that limits greatly the amount of market that they have. If the United States and Europe were to sanction specifically the refineries in places like China, like India, like Turkey, where we know that oil goes, that would be a huge step forward. We have to go after Russia's ability to gain profit. Bill Browder has estimated that it's about $1 billion a day that Russia is making from the oil that it still sells off to refineries. We can stop that, though. It's within our reach. And if we did, it would be a critical disaster for the Russian economy.
Why did Putin need so-called energy truce? What is his plan, and how Trump is using this?
I think that we have to understand for Putin, he's got a couple of objectives here. So when he's looking at this chessboard, he looks at the situation with the United States, and he needs to keep them at least not being adversarial to him. If the United States were to decide tomorrow that it wanted Ukraine to win, it could make that happen. That's the last thing that he wants. And as a result, he has to at least go through all the motions to show that he's very keen to negotiate, that he's keen to end the war as Donald Trump wants. He has to show that. Now, we see through his actions, through his statements, that's not the case. But he has to at least make the appearance that he is interested in achieving what Trump wants to achieve. At the same time, I think that he realized that strategically, it doesn't hurt them a great deal. Look, Kyiv's already been without energy for how much time now, without heating. How does it change in the population? I don't see people asking to end the war and surrender to Russia. Fundamentally, it doesn't change anything. It's just a form of terrorism. It makes people's lives miserable. It'll kill a lot of people, but in no way does it make the war more winnable for Russia. On the alternative, when we see the Ukrainian strikes inside of Russia or on the Shadow Fleet, that is directly made impossible for Russia to engage in warfare. If we go after, as Ukraine is going after, the means of production, going after the means of generating revenue of Russia, that fundamentally changes the equation of the war. That is, in fact, an entire paradigm shift. And that's why it's so important that Ukraine carries out more attacks inside of Russia, targeting the energy sector, targeting oil refineries and things like this. Because without that, Russia cannot engage in war. Ukraine without energy, without heat, will suffer. But it doesn't stop Ukraine from winning.
The next peace talks round in Abu Dhabi will take place on the 4th and the 5th of February. I would like to hear from you your expectations from upcoming meeting, and do you feel that this trilateral format can become a kind of breakthrough in the future?
I think that going ahead, we'll see that the Russians aren't really interested in peace. The Russians, and we've seen this in the Soviet period as well, which is sort of the sad part of all this, is that we're watching history repeat itself again and again. But if you look back at the Soviet period, negotiations always sort of went this way. They would stall, they'd take lots of time, they would make a lot of demands, always make demands. In fact, the Russian negotiating strategy, Soviet negotiating strategy was the same, which is that, in fact, negotiations are just another part of what we see on the battlefield. It's just another aspect of it. So what you can't obtain in the battlefield physically, you can obtain perhaps via negotiations. And that's what they're doing. So we've seen that the Russians are demanding all of Donbas and the rest of these territories that they wish to take. Now, what's so interesting about that? Russia now has been trying to take these regions for 12 years, and Russia has not been able to do it. And just since 2022, they have lost over 1,200,000 soldiers killed or injured. And it is estimated by the British that to take just the rest of Donetsk Oblast would cost over 1 million soldiers killed or injured by Russia. One, they don't have that many soldiers. Two, they don't have the cash for that. And three, they don't have the resources for that. We see that Russia is down to only about 2,000 tanks left. We see that they are using up new missiles the day after they come out of the factory because they're using up their supplies. Russia cannot engage in this war forever. So to just give away part of the Donbas to Russia because it asked for it is absolutely insane. Russia cannot do it by force. And now they're hoping, despite their failures on the battlefield, that they will get it out of the West through these negotiations. Because we'll be so anxious to make a deal with Russia that we will cut Ukraine short. Fortunately, I think at this point, Ukraine itself understands the position and won't fall for these tricks.
Yeah, in such a case, why American and Ukrainian officials express optimism about peace talks, despite the fact that the most controversial issue, as have you mentioned, territorial one, is very far from solution, because neither Kiev nor Moscow flexible about it. So why Americans and Ukrainians believe in best?
Well, I think it's sort of funny is that there's two different ways of looking at this. I think that the American side is always going to say that things are going well, because they have to report that back to the public in the United States. It's necessary that they say that things are going ahead well. If you look at the statements from the White House months and months ago, it was very similar. They said there was a lot of setbacks, but that things were progressing, that there were very good talks with Moscow. But we see that the war is still going. So I wouldn't really pay attention to what people say. It's very normal during peace talks to say things like this. But the facts speak for themselves. Russia is unwilling to make concessions. And Russia, for that matter, is unwilling to see really peacekeepers inside of Ukraine, or really to see support for Ukraine coming from the West. And as a result of that, what Russia is doing is looking for the justification to do two things. One, to get the West to put more pressure on Ukraine. To say, Ukraine, we want to end this war like you do, but we cannot guarantee your peace. And the reason is simple. To have peace, the Russians won't agree to that. And so we're going to have to, unfortunately, not be able to offer you any sort of guarantee. That's something that would play absolutely 100% into the hands of Putin. And the Russians are hoping on that. But second to that is the fact that today the Russians are looking at the situation, realizing that they don't really want a peace, and realizing that ultimately, if they draw this out long enough, the White House has shown it will go back to the Ukrainian side and put more pressure on them. We don't see the White House putting pressure on the Russians. We see them putting pressure on the Ukrainians, which is sort of tragic, but also absurd. Looking ahead, it would be very probable, I think, these peace talks will break down in the near term.
Yeah, but actually, in terms of what you said, how would you assess chances of each participant of these peace talks to outplay the opponent?
Well, I think that there's different strategies that we see being engaged. In the Ukrainian side, I think that it's actually their negotiation strategy has improved a lot, to be honest. It's really improved dramatically. And I think that's partially due to the fact that they have been so very clear that they're serious. From day one, you remember President Zelensky said before New Year's even, he said it's a very difficult time, there's difficult decisions ahead, and they were going to send their best teams to negotiate. And sure enough, when you have people like Kirill Bogdanov, who was the head of the military intelligence in Ukraine, sent to these negotiations, it shows how serious you are. Very senior people, the top of the top, from the Ukrainian side are going to the negotiations. That's because Ukraine is taking it seriously. It sends people that do the economy. It sends people who work on things like the military. It sends people from intelligence, from diplomacy, because it has people from all the spheres necessary to make sure that they have the best people representing Ukraine. Now, on the Russian side, we don't see that. We see that, generally speaking, the people that they've spent historically are people who are actually, one, born in Ukraine, but two, they are people who are not actually engaged in these fields. They're not military experts. They're not people who actually understand the inner workings of bilateral and multilateral peace guarantees, or security guarantees, I should say. Why is that? It's because the Russians are making a show about this. That's why they send people that are ethnic Ukrainians or born in Ukraine during the Soviet period. It's because they're showing that, yeah, we're sending people, but we're sending our sort of Ukrainians. They're trying to just make an entire sideshow from this process. But unfortunately, people don't pick up on the joke. They don't understand what Russia is doing in this. Russia is showing that's not serious. But when the United States has people like Mr. Witkoff representing them, perhaps he's not aware of these finer signals that are being sent.
We see that Putin's envoy, Kirill Dmitriev, visits Miami very often. His last visit happened yesterday. What does he want to achieve in current period of the war?
At this point, Dmitriev, we have to understand, is the personal representative of Vladimir Putin. His wife is the best friend of Vladimir Putin's daughter. His wife is very engaged in business with Putin's daughter. So when he's coming, have no doubt, he's representing the personal interest of Vladimir Putin, not really the Russian state. But he's also in charge of things like the sovereign wealth fund of Russia. As such, he has leverage when he has access to capital. And that capital is something that he's probably trying to use to essentially bribe the American side, to offer them future business contracts, future deals, joint projects between Russia and the United States. So at this point, it seems that is his primary role, is to be a fixer behind the scenes, not working as someone who's a career diplomat or intelligence officer or military officer. But once again, it shows how the Russians are not taking these negotiations at the same level that the Ukrainians are. They're not sending their best people to negotiate. They're sending people who they think can corrupt the process.
International media reported that USA hint Ukraine that any American security guarantees are dependent on our readiness to withdraw Ukrainian troops from all territory of Donbas. And if I have understood correctly, the sequence of actions looks like first Ukraine withdraw troops, and then we will talk about implementation of security guarantees. What do you think about this trajectory and about this sequence?
No, it's absolutely a horrible trajectory, and Ukraine should not accept it. The fact is that the Russians are going to abuse this process in any way that they can, and anything that Russia says or anything that Russia puts on paper is meaningless. Always look for their actions, not their words. Russia says lots of things, but ultimately it means nothing without action. So Ukraine should take no step whatsoever until it has boots on the ground ready to support it.
Yeah, at the same time, Marco Rubio said these security guarantees basically involve the deployment of a small number of European troops, mainly French and British, and support from the US. But in reality, the security guarantee is support from the US. At the same time, Putin's foreign policy aide Yuri Ushakov told that these guarantees had not been agreed with Russia. How do you understand logic of security guarantees implementation with Ukraine and with Russia? Will it be separately?
Yeah, of course it'll be separate. I mean, the fact is, Russia's not going to agree for any sort of security guarantee for Ukraine. And if they do, it'll be of such a useless nature, like the Budapest Memorandum, where it says something sort of, which was not a security guarantee first, but it'll be something that is not really enforceable. It'll be not something that will have immediate action. It will lead to things like strongly worded condemnations if there's a problem, but it will not rise to actually using military force against Russia. Russia won't agree to Ukraine being able to do that in the future. Russia has nothing to gain from that. Russia believes that still it can make sure the West will drive down its support for Ukraine over time as it becomes disinterested and just time passes. And that's why it sees no gain whatsoever in making a deal today that would protect Ukraine in the future. It still believes that it can take Ukraine, if not today, then tomorrow.
Yeah, in such a case, this is a geopolitical dead end. Do you agree?
Yeah. Yes, it is. It is totally a geopolitical dead end.
Yeah, Europeans said to Trump's face that they are not going to put up with new American approach to global security. I would like to hear from you your forecast how EU-US relations could evolve further in terms of transatlantic cooperation.
So first and foremost, I think that what we see right now is that it's a pretty bad state of affairs, to say the least. And it's unfortunate because it's not necessary. It's not being driven by something that is ultimately benefiting the United States. It is something that is totally reckless in nature. But as a result of that, who gains? Let's ask that question. I think that is something that obviously Russia gains in. Russia has always tried to create divide in the NATO alliance. Russia tries to create divide in the United States and in European countries as well. And right now, we see that Russia is succeeding, which is why partially Russia believes that ultimately it'll win in Ukraine, that the West will lose its support for Ukraine because it will see that it's got its own domestic problems to take care of first and foremost. Look at the current crisis between the United States and Denmark. Denmark per capita is one of the largest contributors to Ukraine, if not the largest. Look at the Baltic states. Look at Norway. Look at Sweden. All these countries are in the top 10 donors to Ukraine per capita. And sure enough, today, all of them now have their own security concerns caused by the United States' recklessness towards Greenland. And they also then have to question, can they afford to give all their weaponry to Ukraine right now? Because they might need it tomorrow if there is a conflict that should involve NATO with Russia and the United States doesn't come to their assistance. And that causes them to think about withholding some of their support for Ukraine. And not because they don't want to help Ukraine, but because they simply realize that their own security guarantees mean nothing. That's something that Russia is very happy to see. That is something that benefits Russia. That, in fact, does provide a game changer or a paradigm shift for Russia. So right now, the situation with the United States is complex. I think that the U.S. is not ready to walk away from Europe or from NATO. It's just, one, unrealistic. And secondly, there's not a popular support in the U.S. for that. But going ahead, it does create a lot of problems in the long-term relationship in this network.
Jason, thank you very much for this interview. My pleasure, as always. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
Thank you, Maxim.
Yeah, goodbye.
Take care. Bye-bye.